that question is a perfect segue to the next talk by Stuart Smyth, who will talk about the regulatory system and how it has or has not handled new technologies.
Well, thank you very much, especially to Morris for the invitation. I'm certainly disappointed that Dame Ann Glover can't be here today, so you're going to have to put up with that, damn Stuart Smyth. So Neil's talk was a really good segue into what I want to talk about. And in fact, about an hour ago, I got an email from the journal Trends in Biotechnology. We had an article published today. Peter is co-author on that, along with another colleague of ours in my department. And poignantly, the title of the article is EU Failing FAO Challenge to Improve Global Food Security. So talk about a timely publication to come out today in Trends in Biotech. Hits exactly on what I'm going to talk to you for the next little bit about. So how do we remove politics, and particularly the politics within the European Union, from the approval of crop varieties and international trade? So I'm sure you've all seen this. Clive James and ISAAA puts this out, 28 countries around the world. But really what you can start to see is the gaps, right? We've got Venezuela and Peru as really the only two large countries in the Americas that have not adopted GM crops. But then you start looking at the map of Africa, or the Middle East, or parts of Asia. So that where most of these 2 billion people that are micronutrient deficient are living is where the tan colors appear on the map. So we've got a massive gap in the adoption of technology where food security is most important. So we've done a fair bit of work over the last 3 or 4 years looking at the global impacts of GM crops. I thought I'd share with you the 4 main crop varieties and give you a sense as to where the distribution of benefits are falling. You can see that as technologies move more into the developing countries, the share of benefits massively shifts to farmers growing the crops. Canola, soybeans, corn, predominantly industrialized crops, but corn's moving more into Africa, and particularly the adoption of cotton in India, China, and parts of Africa. You can see that 3/4 of the benefits are accruing to those adopting and planting the technology on an annual basis. Colleagues of ours in Davis have estimated that the global benefits a couple of years ago hit $46 billion. And Brooks and Barfoot put their annual report out about 2 weeks ago based on the 2014 production of GM crops, and they've estimated now that cumulatively over 18 years, we've now reached $150 billion in benefits. A staggering amount. And if you think that maybe half or 3/4 of that is now starting to go to farmers adopting this technology, well, that's a massive contribution to the economic well-being of farmers around the world. So what are some of the impacts from GM crops? Because we've been growing these crops for 20 years in North America now, that gives us the advantage to do some time-sensitive studies. Janet Carpenter a few years ago looked at 168 different studies comparing, looking at GM crop yields. So you can see about 70% of the reports that she found showed yield increases, 20% sort of consistent with what was being used previously, and about slightly under 10% saying that GM crops had a lower yield. Robert Finger then 5 years ago looked at 203 studies concluding that there was no substantial yield boost from a genetically modified crop, but there was a substantial benefit of reduced pest and insect populations allowing yield increases. Rob Ariel looked at 97 studies looking directly at studies that compared GM yields to non-GM yields, finding GM outperformed in developing and developed countries. And then Matan Kaim looked at made a study of 147, finding that chemical uses dropped by over 1/3. Yields are up by 20%. But I think substantially, farm profits are up by almost 70% at a global level. And one of the basic tenets of the research we're doing is that food security is based on households having the resources to purchase food when it's needed. So if those farm profits hadn't increased by 68%, those households would have that much less capital or revenue to buy food on a daily basis. So to break this down a little bit into sort of what are the economic and the environmental and health benefits of GM crops, and Tan Kime, I think probably in one of the studies that's the most important to me, showed from BT cotton adoption, FAO classifies vulnerable households as those households that subsist on less than $2 a day. And he found that in India, households that had adopted GM cotton had increased by 134%. So we're talking about the most vulnerable in society, the most food insecure households. In India, we're having a substantial boost to their household incomes. Hutchison found then that GM corn, about 60% of the benefits spilled over to non-adopters because pest populations were dropping for the farmers that were growing BT corn, and the lower populations also benefited the farmers in the areas that are around those fields that had not adopted BT corn. So a substantial spillover of benefits. Some work that we did here with a graduate student 5 years ago estimated that the economic benefit of herbicide-tolerant canola in Western Canada was about $350 to $400 million a year. Melinda Smale found that GM corn adoption in the Philippines increased household incomes from $400 to $600 a year. And a little addition to that is that some of the households were able to free up the amount of time they had to spend working in their cornfields, and that they could get off the farm jobs to supplement their incomes even further. Jeff Vitale found that in Burkina Faso, conventional cotton produces a profit of about $70 a hectare, and GM bumped that up to $150. I think one of the stories that really never gets mentioned in the popular media or in social media is from the environmental benefits of GM crops, the sustainability aspect. Kimes found that pesticide use just in India alone has dropped by 41%. Jitan Hun, from working in China with Carl Prey and some others at Berkeley and Davis, found that applications have dropped from 14 kilograms a hectare to 4. And if you extend that into the regions, non-BT cotton fields have dropped the application by 75%. So that's and when we're talking about spraying in India and China, we're not talking about high clearance, high capacity sprayers that we see. We're talking about people walking through a cotton field with shorts and a t-shirt and a backpack sprayer, and probably somewhat limited access to water, so if they get chemical residues on their arms or legs, the ability to wash that off by the time they finish that field is not great. We'd estimated that the environmental impact quotient of canola in Western Canada to drop by 53% after 10 years of GM canola use in Western Canada. Brooks and Barfoot showed that the reduction in carbon emissions is equivalent to 10 million vehicles being removed for an entire year. And one story that never gets mentioned is the health benefits. And I think this is an absolute travesty that social media and those that are critical of biotech will simply won't talk about, but I think is one of the reasons that I so strongly support this technology, is that the health impacts are probably the most important thing in why developing countries should have better access to these technologies. Guillaume Guerre and Deb Sengupta did a study looking at the adoption of BT cotton, and they found that in 2003, when BT cotton is commercialized, the suicide rate in Indian farmers plateaus. They projected and extended the rate of suicide at that point in time and extended it out to 2011, and they found that had BT cotton not been commercialized, the suicide rate would have been 1/3 higher than what it was. And environmental groups still, Vandiva Shiva still says that BT cotton kills Indian farmers, causes them to commit suicide. These results have been out for 5 years, and they still perpetuate this lie. Jennifer mentioned last night, our friend Martin Gauss found that hand weeding, which is done by females, results in 10 to 12 fewer days per season. So they get 2 crops in South Africa. That's 3 weeks less labor, back-breaking work done in the hot sun. IFPRI defines this as drudgery. So it's not like we go out and do a bit of weeding in our garden for a few minutes after work. Having to have 3 weeks additional time that you can spend with your kids or hauling more water to your vegetable garden, those are substantial impacts that simply don't get mentioned. And I think then probably most importantly, the reduction in the cases of pesticide poisonings. Jeff Vitale's estimated that there's 30,000 fewer cases in Burkina Faso alone. Matankheim estimates this could be anywhere from 2.5 to 9 million people. So for those of you not familiar with pesticide poisoning, when you get it, it's like a extremely, I guess the best way would be an extremely severe case of the flu. It knocks you on your ass for about 2 weeks. You're really incapable of getting out of bed. So if you're the person responsible for field management in many developing countries and you can't get out of bed for 2 weeks, what's going to happen to that crop? If you've got a cotton crop that needs to be sprayed every 3rd or 4th day because of boll weevils and you've now got pesticide poisoning, who's going to do that? Well, in some cases it's the kids. So the 13 or 14-year-old child gets pesticide poisonings. That's a travesty against humanity, in my opinion. But, of course, the environmental groups fail to take that into account. Virtually every developing country has had one of, if not all 3 of these. So we've got an abundance of information. So why aren't these technologies getting through? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. Our regulatory systems are not structured to take advantage of 20 years of, probably more, probably closer to 25 years of technology change. The regulatory systems that we have in North America were put together in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. That would be like saying that the regulation of the automotive industry should still rely on the Model T. Yet, clearly that's not the case. Yet we still have a regulatory system based on trying to regulate technologies that Neil was just talking about, based on technologies that were developed 30 years ago. And now our regulatory systems are part of corporate investment decision. BASF moved all of their R&D, over 800 jobs out of Europe. The European regulatory system's now been politicized. It's not about science. It's about political power of environmental groups and green parties to get control of environmental ministries and ag ministries to make sure that these technologies do not get commercialized, particularly in developing countries. And I think the really telling tale is the last bullet, that 20 years ago, 1/3 of global ag R&D was spent in Europe. And that was the point that GM crops were commercialized, and it's less than 10% today. They've lost over 1% of global ag R&D a year for the last 2 decades. That is a killing factor to innovation in agriculture in Europe, and I think it's going to start to spill over to other sectors of the European economy, that other sectors in the economy are going to say, why would we invest in Europe? They're not an innovative part of the globe anymore. So what are some of the challenges? Well, we've seen a variety or a multitude of trade agreements. We've got the Canada-Europe trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the EU and the US are currently undergoing the TTIP negotiations. There's been absolutely nothing about biotech, GM crops, or the challenges from those. The CETA agreement between us and Europe says that this is an issue that's got some challenges and it's going to be subject to ongoing dialogue. Well, so clearly, Europe's not even willing to engage with Canada to address substantial regulatory and trade challenges. They say it's something we need to talk further about. So 5 years go by, 10 years go by, 20 years go by, we still haven't resolved anything. Last year, the EU decided that since they had really lost control of the ability to actually approve any GM crops within the EU, they would now allow member states to decide this back at a state level. So immediately, 19 of the 28 member states of the EU opted to ban GM crops. And to some extent, I think their regulatory system in Europe is in gridlock. It struggles to approve varieties for import, but that's taking anywhere from 3 and 5 year delays. And there's varieties that have been in the system for over a decade that simply have not got through. I think one of the concerning things, and this really sort of bridges to one of the questions that Neil had, this is now a hugely contentious political issue within the EU. You can see that January of last year, a collection of leading environmental groups have started to lobby the Commission to make sure that GM or new breeding techniques are banned within the EU. And here's the takeaway message. They want to make sure that none of these technologies are treated as conventional agriculture. They want to make sure every single one of them is listed as genetic modification and biotechnology. And they will ban the import of those crops if they can't detect them. I was at a conference in Amsterdam last fall talking to a regulator from Germany about how to regulate these new plant breeding techniques. And I said, so what are you going to do if Canada adopts one of these new technologies to develop new varieties of canola? You receive a shipment and you can't tell what technology was used to create that variety canola. She looked at me and she said, you know what the answer is. I said, your only option, your default setting is to reject. She said, absolutely. They will reject every technology, every crop variety that they do not, with 100% certainty, know what technology created that variety. This is a huge concern for global agriculture moving forward. So, one of the areas that I love to work in is looking at socioeconomic considerations developed through the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. I largely love to work in it because it gives me the ability to interact online with the community that's so highly critical of biotech. So this was an international agreement that was a supplement to the Convention on Biological Diversity. It was largely driven by the EU, and it's now in about 170 countries. Argentina, Canada, and the US are 3 of the top 5 GM crop producing countries in the world, and we're not members to it. So that creates some challenges. This is Article 26. Most of the Convention on Biological Diversity is not very contentious. 90% of the global challenge relates to Article 26. There's a few things that are really coming into play. So this is a voluntary regulatory requirement. Yet right now there's an ongoing process to make sure, and the NGOs are pushing so hard to make this mandatory. They want to change the language of the protocol to say that developing countries must take socioeconomic issues into consideration. They want to make it a mandatory obligation for developing countries considering the adoption of GM crops. The language says they have to be consistent with existing international obligations, which all of these countries are signatories to the WTO, the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization uses a science-based definition of risk assessment. These countries want to reject the WTO classification of risk assessment, putting them in violation of the WTO. So they're breaking their obligations to existing international agreements. This one really gets them riled up when I raise the fact that you can only take a socioeconomic consideration under assessment if there's an impact arising from the commercialization of a GM crop in your country. There's been absolutely zero discussion about what would trigger a socioeconomic impact. None whatsoever. And then the last one is these can only be applied if they relate to conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. So it's a very narrow and tight definition of what is a socioeconomic consideration. Well, let me show you what the Norwegian government thinks socioeconomic consideration should be. They've got state department there called GNOC, and GNOC, funded by the Norwegian government, is one of the strongest advocates for socioeconomic considerations to kill innovation in developing countries. You can see these issues. In some cases, there isn't even any methodology developed that would be capable of doing this type of an assessment. If we had a methodology and we had data in Canada, it would probably take us 1.5 to 2 years to do this assessment. Developing countries would have to go out and gather the data. At a minimum, it would take 5 years to be able to do a single risk assessment in any one of these areas. In some cases, as I said, there's simply no methodology to even be able to understand what an impact would be at a developing country. So for example, labor. Well, we know there's a lot less people farming today than there was 30 years ago. Is that a benefit to our society? Or would that be viewed as a negative externality for modern agriculture? There's no response on that. So part of what we did is we said, well, how are these regulatory lags factoring into delays in innovation? So Phillips McDougall put out their study 5 years ago saying that it cost about $136 million to get global approval for a new GM crop. I extended that with a colleague of mine at IFPRI. So we sort of estimated this at different levels of return on investment, 20, 50, 75, and 100%. We discounted and said the technology would be good for about 10 years. So you can see here that at a 20% return on investment, the yellow line goes from positive to negative after a 2-year delay. When we up the investment to 100%, the private companies in this space can afford to go a little bit longer. But you can see at 3 years, they've, sort of moving from year 3 to 4, they lose half their potential ROI on investing in any new technology. By 7 years, it flattens out and it hits 0. So what's our concern about this? Well, in many developing countries, research is done by national ag research centers. And a 20% ROI is probably a pretty good return on their investment. So what happens now if new breeding techniques are classified as GM and they can't develop any new varieties because they're going to lose money on every single thing they develop? I think these environmental groups that are based and funded out of Europe, they don't want to stop biotech, they want to stop all ag research in developing countries. For example, they've pushed through a regulation in socioeconomics in Malawai's Biosafety that said there can be no negative economic impacts, not one. So that means if somebody loses their job on a farm, that's a negative economic impact. Can you imagine where we would be with any other technology in our society? Where would we be with cell phones? Well, my goodness, somebody got killed crossing the street or texting while they were driving. I mean, how ludicrous is it to apply this type of a concept to food? So, the other strong message that gets sent to developing countries is in international trade and how the EU treats low-level presence and adventitious presence. In 2003, when EFSA was established, it coordinated all of this at the EU level. Prior to that, it had been at the member state level. And when adventitious presence, or LLP, was detected, trade still functioned. We've documented this in 5 or 6 cases where companies in Canada and the States had accidentally commingled GM with breeder's seed. They simply managed it, they contained it, they harvested it, burned it. But what they didn't do was they didn't close the border to international trade. And that's what the establishment of EFSA has resulted in at the European level. So I'll give you a couple of examples. In 2009, there was a little bit of GM flax detected in Belgium and Germany that originated from Canada. So what was the first thing that the EU did? They slammed the border shut to all flax exports from Canada. It cost the Canadian flax industry about 30 million bucks. The EU cost their flax processing industry about 40 million euro, resulted in 600 job losses. We put a stewardship program in place that costs our farmers about $1 million a year. But the frustrating thing is there's absolutely no incentive to stop this stewardship program. The Canadian flax industry isn't going to voluntarily say, oh, we're stopping it. We think Europe's still going to import our flax if we don't test it. Europe's not going to turn around and say to Canada, well, yeah, we want you to stop that program because our consumers are so confident in the products you're exporting. This cost of $1 million a year is going to go on in perpetuity. There's absolutely no way any country that puts in a stewardship program to try and make sure that LLP and AP issues are minimized can ever get out of this trap. It's a continuous cycle of negative impacts for the exporters. The states have had this problem with Herculex corn. In 2000, a variety was submitted. It took 6 years just to get that variety through, and by then they'd already had follow-up technology with rootworm corn. The gluten feed market dropped by 30 to 40% for 3 years. When we look at LL601 rice, it cost Bayer over $2 billion, over 1,000 different lawsuits. And the last research that I've been able to find on this showed that about 4 years ago, rice exports to back to the EU were only about 40% of what they'd previously been. So even if you do have a trade disruption, you don't get back to that level of trade that pre-existed. So when we see industrial countries like Canada and the States struggling to export non-GM or GM-free products to the EU, that message gets really carried over to the developing countries. And I really love this quote by the EU ambassador to Kenya, blackmailing them, saying that if you adopt GM crops, it's going to be very difficult for you to export anything to Europe. Nothing like putting a gun to their head. So this last point that I want to bring up really strikes at the heart of how nefarious Europe is about this technology. So under the WTO, member countries are allowed to set a preferential tariff on products that are imported. And they can do this for individual countries and even individual products coming from a country. Yet what Europe does is they say to developing countries, if you want this lower tariff rate for your product, you have to ratify and adopt the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, which is the biggest barrier to innovation in agriculture in the developing world. It's based on the precautionary principle. So they're very, I would say it's a little bit unethical to put this type of a stipulation on a preferential trade agreement. So we're seeing that the Cartagena Protocol is a huge barrier to innovation. And they're going to lose market access if they adopt any GM crop. So what's the EU been saying about agriculture? Well, in 2013, UNCTAD put out its annual report, written predominantly by European authors, concluding at the bottom that food security in developing countries is going to rely on a return to largely organic, small-scale farming practices. I don't know. They've been doing that for 6,000 or 8,000 years, and they're asking for new technologies. I would think that they might be looking for something different than that. What else are they saying? Well, this has been in the news lately. The G7 group of countries struck up the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition to try and lift 50 million people out of poverty by 2050, and the EU Parliament calls it a mistake. And they're actually trying to encourage the G7 to move away from a commitment to GM crops. So, at a political level, we see the EU's rejecting science-based evidence that there's massive and substantial and ongoing benefits to GM crops in the developing world. They're intimidating countries to sign up and be part of the Cartagena Protocol, and they're blackmailing countries into not adopting GM crops. So, what can we do? How are we going to make sure that these countries have a chance to have some sovereignty for themselves to decide whether or not food security can be decided at a domestic level? last year, the anti-biotech movement spent over $10 billion globally fighting biotech. The most recent numbers I have show that in 2011, the big 6 multinationals didn't even spend that much on ag R&D. So that shows you what a huge political this issue is at a global level. If they give an inch, they lose everything in the environmental space. This is going to be a fight to the death by the environmental groups. They will never concede a single benefit to biotech. So what do we do? Well, I propose there's 2 radical changes that need to be done. And now those of you that know me are probably thinking, oh shit, what's he going to say now? Well, the first one is we need to help developing countries opt out of the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. This is a killer of ag innovation, nothing more. This is stopping ag innovation at every single level in developing countries, and it will. I would call on environmental group or philanthropic organizations. They really need to step up and champion the benefits of biotech at the developing country level. Academics need to be better engaged to do studies of where adoption has taken place, to look at what the cost of not adopting BT cotton is in neighboring countries like Ghana, Chad, Togo. This research needs to be presented to parliamentarians and leaders of countries and key senior regulators so that they understand that not making a decision or making the decision to ban GM crops is going to be extremely costly when it is measured in terms of food security. The second one is we need to find a way to fence Europe out of global ag trade. All of the trade agreements that exist between developing countries and the EU need to be ended. We need to really push Canada, the States, and Australia to supplement these agreements, especially when it comes to products of new breeding techniques. Europe is going to reject every single one of those. And what developing country is going to be willing to use CRISPR to develop a new variety of sweet potato or ground nuts or bananas if they risk losing the entire EU market because they adopt that technology? Who does this and how? Well, I think federally in Canada and the States that our governments need to step up and make a stronger commitment and contribution to improving global food security, and that the philanthropic organizations need to partner with this. This research can then be done through peer review granting process to help these developing countries understand the cost of not adopting biotechnology and to develop a network of support to help them opt out of the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. We need to do a better job at lobbying our elected politicians. They need to understand that agriculture and global food security is the most important issue for our industrial economies in this day and age. The reality is if we're going to feed a world of 2050, we need to spend the next 10 years trying to deconstruct the barriers that have been put in place over the last 25 or 30 years that GM crops have been in existence. Science, as Neil has shown, I have no doubts that science can improve, can feed a world of 10 billion, 12 billion without any issue. The problem is we're not going to get them regulated and approved for use in the countries that need them the most. This is where our efforts need to be doubled up and refocused for the next decade if we have any hope of feeding a world in 2050. I'd like to thank the partners that fund my research. And if you're interested in following me on Twitter or my blog on Twitter, tune in for some controversy. Thank you.
One of the challenges at international events is sometimes getting people to come out of their shell and tell us what they really think. So maybe the questions can get Stuart to come out of his shell and tell us what he thinks. Biotech.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it's very important what you have just raised. I have a question, perhaps on a more positive note. I don't know. But would you like to elaborate a bit further about off-patent? Because we know the first, at least one, if I'm not wrong, Monsanto's trade was actually went off-patent 1 or 2 years ago. And what it will represent on the positive side, but also on the regulatory side, I mean, the challenges ahead. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that. And if I want to just take 1 minute again to your point about federal government, I just want to invite all of the presenters here, domestic and international participants, that there's an ongoing consultation right now, an international assistance review. And we are actually seeking, I'm actually working for a Global Affairs Canada, the Food Security Division. So we're collecting views and inviting the public in Canada and abroad, as I said, about what the government should do in terms of, I mean, the whole assistance, the international assistance, but including particularly food security and agriculture internationally. So you just can Google Global Affairs Canada and you will find information about the consultation. Otherwise, you can talk to me later on. I can send you the information directly. So about off-patent, if you want to tell us more of your insights, we appreciate it. Thank you.
Several of the international partnerships, such as the WEMA project, for example, a lot of the intellectual property has been donated license-free, so there's no royalty requirements. I know that FAO had a discussion probably 8 or 10 years ago about establishing a revenue pool so that they could go out and purchase specific patents for developing country research that would really facilitate a variety development. So I think that sort of pushed some of the companies into donating more of their technology license-free or you know, donating it to these public-private partnerships in many countries. So I'm from the look or the view I've taken on it, I don't see patents as being a huge challenge for moving forward in this area.
If I just want to clarify, is that when they go off patent and they basically go to the public domain, the issue basically is who will pay for deregulating this in the EU or China. So the point is about, there is now an AGA court, which I believe is in place until 2021, and after that is somehow unclear who will actually pay or eventually be committed or responsible for doing that, especially for markets like the EU that you referred to, that requires renewing the approval. So that's an issue that has to be addressed. And I have no idea about what could happen, but.
Yeah.
So thank you for your interesting talk. And very depressing it was too. So I'm not only English, but I'm a true European. And our problem happens to be that we haven't got a single scientist in government in the UK. And our EU agricultural minister was unable to differentiate between barley, wheat, rye, and oats. He just didn't know which was which. So we have a really depressing future unless some of us actually leave science and go into politics and try and influence GM in Europe.
I agree that the level of ignorance, not just in Europe, but North America too, at a political level is staggering. That too many people have been educated by social media about food and agriculture production.
Well, our government is rich in classically educated men, so much that one of them asked me what a molecule is and asked me, if I put a molecule in my drawer beside my bed at night, will it still be there in the morning? So how do you respond to that?
That's a good question, isn't it?
I think you have to ask Charlie about that. Yes, great presentation, Stuart. I really enjoyed it. Two things. In your recent publication, did you delve into the development of this political view in Europe to any degree that would give us more insight in, one, how it happened, and two, what to do with it? That's the first question. And secondly, I'm sure fellow politicians or ex-politicians like my colleagues here and others would would suggest there are ways that you can take your message to cabinet caucuses or provincially and federally and other places to get the message, because you can influence politicians. And obviously they've been influenced in the wrong way in Europe. And when we were discussing things like the North American Free Trade Agreement here, we had people present cases for why there may be benefits and costs, and we could make that decision. But I'm sure the local government of Saskatchewan would have an ag caucus that would be very interested, and then that goes up to the cabinet committee, and the same federally. And we need to arm our political leaders so that they can make appropriate companion policies, economic and political, along with the genetic, so we can actually be somewhat successful in providing food security. Because you're absolutely correct in my view. You will not have global food security without dealing with the socioeconomic and political conditions that are developed. So congratulations, a very, very good paper.
Thanks, Grant. I've talked to farmers here, and you know, when I ask the people that I grew up with and are friends with at farm, I say, you know, why did you adopt them? And their response was, I make more money per acre. I heard an African farmer at a conference about 4 or 5 years ago, and somebody asked him the same question, why did you adopt BT corn? And his response was, I make more money per acre. So if a farmer in Canada and a farmer in South Africa are adopting it because they make more money, I think we can present those numbers to government officials in all these countries saying, look, if you adopt this, your farmers are going to make more money. That's a benefit that works, it trickles its way up through the economy. And you know, when you have a drought, you're going to have to devote less money to buying food aid. So you know, investing $1 million in development of a new variety could save you $10 or $15 million down the road in having to purchase food aid. So laying these arguments out, I think we need to be much more proscriptive and proactive in talking to the governments of these developing countries, sort of explaining some of the options.
Just to answer my first question, did you find out anything in your research from the European history that showed how it got off track?
The best response I've seen is that in the mid-90s, when this technology was coming out, Europe was still flush under the cap system with ag subsidies. And so farmers within Europe didn't have to demand access to the best technologies, whereas we had started to cut our subsidies in the early 90s in Canada and the States. And so farmers said, okay, well, we're losing some of our subsidies. We need to be as efficient and technologically as advanced as we possibly can be. European farmers still had the luxury of all these production subsidies. They didn't need the technology to make a good return per acre. And so by the time their subsidies started to tighten up 10, 12 years ago, it was too late. They'd lost control of the technology to the environmentalists.
Final question.
Stuart, really enjoyed your talk, and you maybe partially just answered my question. So in addition to the political and sociological forces that you talked about that underpin the EU's obstructionist policies, is some of it just bald economics of inhibiting competition with the major GM exporting countries like the US and Canada?
That's a good question, because Europe's still food insecure. I mean, what they've done is they've pushed the fact that they don't want GM crops onto developing countries where we have some of the most biosensitive environments in the world. So they're importing all their GM soybeans from Brazil to feed their livestock because they won't grow GM soybeans in Europe. Well, when it comes to the management of the rainforest and protection of the rainforest, does it make, to me, I've got a big ethical problem with European NGOs saying, oh, it's fine for us to cut down more forest in Brazil to grow soybeans, as long as we don't have to grow GM soybeans in France or Germany. I think it's really a political dilemma that they're going to have to resolve. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Let me make 2 quick concluding comments, and then I think Morris wants to say something. The emergence and use of new technology is about finding feasible pathways. Clearly, the biotech GM revolution tripped into some back quarters and found difficulties in getting there. And I think what we've heard from our speakers is part of it starts at the industrial scientific level of how you construct and design and manage the evolution of the technology, but part of it similarly is the creation and management and cultivation of robust, responsive public systems that can make choices that are better for us than ones that aren't. And this isn't just an erudite conversation. Some of you may be part of the same listservs I am. There apparently was an attempt on the life of one of the EFSA GMO analysts earlier, I think it was last week, and so by a mail bomb. So these are things that people are projecting into the public space in ways that are not normal for the scientific dialogue and discussion that we're all part of. So I think it's an important issue. It won't end today, but I think we had an excellent presentation from our two speakers and from those who wanted to discuss it. So on that, I'd like to thank both speakers.
And just a couple of notes. One is to say thank you for the sponsor of the last session, which is the Canadian Canola Growers Association. And secondly, local food security. We're going to have lunch in a minute. Thank you very much to Nestle for providing us with lunch today. Thank you.